Is that a hickey on your neck, Denise? Mark's voice cut through the buzz of the cocktail party, loud enough to turn a few heads. Denise froze, her manicured hand brushing self-consciously at her bare neck. Her smile wavered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly, throwing her husband a look that was half amusement, half scorn. Don't be ridiculous, Mark. It's just a bruise from yoga. I told you we were practicing inversions today. Mark's stomach churned. He wanted to believe her, but that slight hesitation? It was like a neon sign flashing lie in his face. Denise had been slippery lately, disappearing for hours with vague excuses. Her yoga classes suddenly lasted until late at night, and her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, was now glued to her side. Always face down. But it wasn't just that. It was the new lingerie, delicate black lace set she hadn't worn for him. The barely there perfume, subtle yet unfamiliar, lingering on her skin when she came home. And the way her laughter rang a little too bright when she spoke about her instructor, Gabe, the lithe and charismatic new teacher at her studio. Mark wasn't the jealous type. At least he hadn't been. But damn if Denise didn't seem to be giving him every reason to become one. He drained his whiskey, feeling the burn slide down his throat as he forced himself to smile at the curious partygoers now glancing their way. Yoga's getting dangerous, huh? You sure you're not doing MMA on the side? Denise laughed, her teeth flashing white against her crimson lipstick. You know me, always pushing limits. She grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, the bubbly liquid catching the light as she sipped, her eyes darting toward the terrace. Mark followed her gaze. There he was, Gabe, leaning against the railing, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes hidden behind a pair of aviators despite the setting sun. It was the first time Mark had seen him in person, and he immediately hated him. Excuse me, darling, Denise purred, her tone syrupy sweet. I need to freshen up. Mark watched her saunter off, her hips swaying in that dress she'd bought just for tonight. His jaw tightened. For the first time in their 18 years of marriage, he felt like a stranger in his own relationship. Mark waited until Denise disappeared into the crowd before heading toward the terrace. His gut told him Gabe wouldn't be far behind. And sure enough, as Mark stepped into the cool night air, he spotted him slipping through a side door leading into the garden. Mark didn't hesitate. He followed, his footsteps purposeful but silent, like a hunter tracking prey. The garden was dimly lit, the faint glow of fairy lights strung through the hedges barely illuminating the winding path. Mark caught a flash of movement up ahead and quickened his pace. He rounded a corner and froze. Denise and Gabe stood close, too close. Her back was to him, but her posture was unmistakable. The slight tilt of her head, the way her hand rested lightly on Gabe's arm. And Gabe? Mark clenched his fists at the smug grin on the younger man's face, his free hand reaching up to tuck a stray strand of Denise's hair behind her ear. I can't stay long, Denise murmured, her voice low, but carrying in the still night air. Mark's already suspicious. You worry too much, Gabe replied, his tone dripping with confidence. You've got him wrapped around your little finger. He'll never catch on. Mark stepped forward, the crunch of gravel under his shoes breaking the spell. Denise spun around, her eyes wide with panic as she saw him standing there, arms crossed and face like stone. Mark, she gasped, her voice breathless. I was just... Save it, he snapped, his gaze boring into hers before shifting to Gabe. You've got some nerve, buddy. Smoking on someone else's property while putting your hands where they don't belong. Gabe raised his hands in mock surrender, a cocky smile tugging at his lips. Relax, man. Denise and I were just talking. Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment he considered decking him right then and there. But no, not yet. He needed more. Concrete proof. He wasn't about to let Denise wriggle out of this with more lies about innocent conversations or misunderstandings. Talking, huh? Mark's voice was calm, too calm. Then you won't mind if I join in? Denise stammered, her face flushing deep red. Mark, you're making a scene. I'm just getting started. He cut her off, his eyes locked on Gabe. So, tell me, how long have you been her yoga instructor? Or is that just your cover? Gabe chuckled, but there was a flicker of unease in his expression. I don't know what you're implying, but maybe you should trust your wife a little more. Mark stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Trust is earned, not given. And right now, neither of you has earned a damn thing. Before either could respond, Mark turned on his heel and strode back toward the party, leaving them standing there in awkward silence. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mark spent the next 2 days in a haze of planning. He wasn't a fool, and he wasn't about to let Denise think she'd won. Instead, he decided to play the long game. If she thought she was clever, he would prove he was 10 steps ahead. On Monday morning, Mark walked into his office at the real estate firm he co-owned and shut the door. He booted up his laptop and called in a favor from an old buddy, Rick, who now worked in private investigations. "Rick, I need you to tail someone," Mark said, skipping pleasantries. "Everything all right?" Rick asked, his tone cautious. "Not even close," Mark replied. "It's my wife. I think she's screwing around with her yoga instructor. Name's Gabe. Works at Body Flow Studio on Main." Rick whistled low. "That's rough, man. You sure you want to know?" "I need to know," Mark said firmly. "I want phone records, schedules, photos, whatever it takes. And I need it fast." "Consider it done," Rick promised. By Wednesday, Mark had the answers he dreaded, but expected. Rick delivered a folder thick with evidence. Texts between Denise and Gabe, laced with innuendo and unmistakable plans for secret meetups. Photos of them leaving a motel on the outskirts of town. Even a time-stamped receipt from a late-night dinner charge to Denise's credit card. Mark's blood boiled as he sifted through the damning proof. She hadn't just lied. She'd gone to extraordinary lengths to humiliate him. Worse, she probably thought she was getting away with it. Well, not for long. Mark returned home that evening with the folder tucked under his arm. Denise greeted him in the kitchen, her smile sweet but strained. "You're home late," she said, sliding a casserole dish into the oven. "Busy day at the office?" "Something like that," Mark replied, his voice even. He watched her move around the kitchen, feigning normalcy as though nothing was amiss. It took everything in him not to throw the evidence on the table and demand an explanation. But he held back. He wanted her to feel secure, to dig her own grave just a little deeper. "I thought we could have a quiet night in," Denise said, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "It's been a while since we just talked." Mark raised an eyebrow, but took the glass she offered. "Sounds good," he said, sitting down at the table. "Why don't you start?" Denise hesitated, her smile faltering for a moment. "Start what?" "Talking," Mark said, his tone deceptively casual. "You know, about your day? Or maybe about Gabe." The wine glass slipped from Denise's hand, shattering against the tile floor. She stared at him, her face pale. "What are you talking about?" Mark leaned back in his chair, a slow, menacing smile spreading across his face. "You're a terrible liar, Denise. And now I've got the proof." He tossed the folder onto the table, its contents spilling out like Pandora's box. Denise's hands shook as she flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from shock to anger to panic. "Mark, it's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," Mark snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult my intelligence any more than you already have." Tears welled in Denise's eyes, but Mark wasn't moved. "We can fix this," she said desperately. "It was a mistake, Mark. I swear." "No," he interrupted, his voice cold. "The mistake was thinking you could play me. Now it's my turn." Denise's tears flowed freely now, her attempts to salvage the moment growing more frantic. "Mark, please," she begged, her hands clutching at his arm. "It didn't mean anything. I love you. Ido." Mark shrugged her off, his expression icy. "Love me? You got a real funny way of showing it, Denise. Lying, sneaking around, screwing some 2-bit yoga instructor in motel rooms. That's love to you." She sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she mumbled. I was just lonely. You've been so distant lately, and don't you dare try to pin this on me," Mark snarled, slamming his fist on the table. "You're the one who broke our marriage, not me. And don't think I don't know every detail." Denise's head snapped up, her face pale. "What do you mean, every detail?" Mark smirked, pulling out his phone and tapping a few buttons. He slid it across the table, the screen displaying one of the photos Rick had taken. Denise and Gabe kissing in the parking lot of the motel, her arms draped around his neck. She recoiled, as if the image had struck her. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Doesn't matter," Mark replied. "What matters is what I'm going to do next." Denise's voice broke as she pleaded. "Mark, we can work through this. I'll do anything, therapy, counseling. Please, just don't give up on us." Mark tilted his head, as if considering her words. Then he stood abruptly, towering over her. "Oh, I'm not giving up," he said, his tone laced with menace. "But I'm done playing the fool. It's my turn to take control." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of carefully laid plans. Mark played the dutiful husband to perfection, pretending to accept Denise's apologies and promises of change. He wanted her to believe she had a chance to win him back, to let her guard down just enough for him to execute his plan. Denise, desperate to cling to her facade of reconciliation, eagerly played along. She cooked his favorite meals, fawned over him in public, and even deleted Gabe's contact from her phone, though Mark knew she'd memorized the number by now. On Friday evening, Mark announced he'd planned a special date night to rekindle their spark. Denise's face lit up with hope, and she threw herself into preparing for the evening. She wore a sleek black dress he'd always admired, paired with heels she hadn't touched in years. "You look beautiful," Mark said, his voice soft and sincere. It wasn't a lie. Even now, as his anger simmered beneath the surface, he couldn't deny that she looked stunning. "Thank you," Denise replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I want a night to be perfect." "Oh, it will be," Mark said, smiling. But only he knew the depths of that promise. Mark drove them to an upscale restaurant downtown, one they hadn't visited since their anniversary years ago. The romantic ambience, soft candlelight, and live piano music created the perfect illusion of a couple rekindling their love. Denise seemed genuinely moved, her nervous energy softening into what almost looked like relief. "This is wonderful, Mark," she said, her eyes glistening. "I didn't think we'd get back to a place like this." Mark smiled across the table, lifting his glass of wine. "To new beginnings," he said. Denise raised her glass, her hand trembling slightly as it clinked against his. "To new beginnings." They dined on filet mignon and scallops, their conversation polite and carefully devoid of any real substance. Mark played the part of the attentive husband perfectly, steering the evening toward a crescendo of false intimacy. After dessert, he leaned forward, his tone conspiratorial. "I have a surprise for you." Denise's eyes widened. "A surprise? What is it?" Mark reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. Denise gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mark, you didn't—" "I wanted to show you I'm serious about us," he said, sliding the box across the table. Denise opened it with trembling fingers, revealing a delicate diamond bracelet nestled inside. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mark, I don't deserve this." "No, you don't," he said, his tone cold as ice. Denise froze, her eyes snapping to his. "What?" Mark leaned back, his smile gone, replaced by a hard, unforgiving stare. "You heard me. You don't deserve it. But I wanted to give you one last night, to feel special before I take it all away." The color drained from Denise's face. "Mark, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about consequences, Denise," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You think I'd let you humiliate me, betray me, and just walk away with a few crocodile tears? No. You're going to pay for what you've done." Denise didn't speak for several moments, her shock rendering her mute. Mark took a sip of his wine, watching her squirm, savoring every second. "You don't mean that," she finally said, her voice trembling. "We can fix this, Mark. We can." "We're past fixing," he interrupted. "You threw that away the moment you let him touch you. But don't worry, Denise. You won't be the only one paying for this." Her eyes widened in horror. "What do you mean?" Mark's smile returned, this time with a sinister edge. "Let's just say Gabe's career is about to take a nosedive. Turns out his yoga instructor certifications are forged, and the studio's owner wasn't thrilled to learn about his extracurricular activities with married clients." Denise's hand flew to her chest. "You wouldn't." "I already did," Mark said flatly. "By Monday, he'll be unemployed, blacklisted, and out of options. And as for you, what about me?" Denise whispered, tears streaming down her face. Mark leaned in, his voice a quiet, venomous whisper. "You're going to lose everything. The house, the cars, the life you're so desperate to keep. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd never met me." Denise stared at Mark, her face pale as his words sank in. She gripped the edge of the table, as though it might steady her in the storm of his revelations. "Mark, please," she choked out. "You don't have to do this. I'll leave Gabe, I swear. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Mark's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Make it right?" "Denise, there's no right after what you've done. You made your choice. Now it's my turn." Denise looked around the restaurant, her humiliation evident as she realized the tables nearest them had taken notice of their escalating conversation. Mark noticed too, but he didn't care. "Let them see. Let them all see. I think we're done here," Mark said, throwing his napkin onto the table. "Enjoy your bracelet while you can. It might fetch you a couple of bucks at the pawn shop once I've cleared out the accounts." He stood, throwing down a few bills to cover the check, and walked toward the exit, leaving Denise trembling and alone at the table. Mark drove home alone, the rage inside him tempered by the cold satisfaction of knowing his plan was unfolding perfectly. Denise's world was about to crumble, and she had no one to blame but herself. When he arrived, he wasted no time. He had already filed for divorce earlier that week, citing infidelity and requesting full ownership of their assets. Mark had been smart, keeping meticulous records of his financial contributions to their life over the years, while Denise, trusting and careless, had left her tracks bare for him to follow. And then there was Gabe. Mark had sent copies of the private investigator's photos and texts to the studio's owner, an old client from his real estate firm. It hadn't taken much convincing to get Gabe fired on the spot. Mark smiled grimly, imagining the smug bastard packing up his locker, his reputation in ruins. He wasn't done, though. Not yet. The next morning, Mark walked into the house with his attorney. Denise, still in her robe and looking haggard, froze as they entered. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "This is Janet," Mark said, gesturing to the stern-looking woman at his side. "She's here to oversee the inventory of the house. I'm making sure you don't walk off with anything that doesn't belong to you." Denise's eyes filled with fresh tears. "You can't do this, Mark. This is my home, too." "Not anymore," Mark said coldly. "You gave up that right when you decided your yoga sessions were more important than our marriage." Janet stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "We'll need to start with the master bedroom. If you have any personal items you'd like to remove, now's the time." Denise sobbed openly as Mark turned away, his heart hardened against her pleas. By the following week, Mark had moved out of the house entirely, leaving Denise with nothing but her humiliation and a mountain of legal battles ahead. She tried to contact him repeatedly, begging for a second chance, but he ignored every call, every text. One evening, as he sat in his new apartment, savoring the peace of his fresh start, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Rick, accompanied by a photo. Gabe, sitting alone in a dingy motel parking lot, a single duffel bag at his feet. Mark smirked, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "Checkmate," he muttered to himself. Mark spent the following days tying up loose ends. Every corner of Denise's comfortable life was unraveling, and he ensured it happened methodically. Their joint accounts were frozen, leaving her scrambling for money. The house, now solely in his name after presenting his lawyer's findings of her infidelity, was scheduled for sale, and she had been served an official eviction notice. He relished the irony of Denise, always so obsessed with appearances, now being the subject of gossip in their social circle. Her friends, well, the ones she hadn't alienated, avoided her calls, unwilling to get caught in the fallout. And Gabe? He'd fled town within days, leaving Denise to face the mess alone. It was a rainy Friday when Denise finally cornered him outside his office. Mark had just finished a meeting when he saw her standing by his car, drenched and desperate. "Mark," she began, her voice trembling. "Please, can we talk?" He sighed, looking at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. What could you possibly have left to say? Denise stepped closer, water dripping from her hair onto her ruined designer coat. "I was wrong, okay? I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But we've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away over one stupid affair." Mark's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You threw it away, Denise. You made that choice the moment you decided to lie to my face and sneak around like some lovesick teenager." "I wasn't thinking," she insisted. "It didn't mean anything, Mark. You have to believe me." He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Oh, I believe you, Denise. I believe that you didn't think. But that's not my problem anymore. You made your bed. Now lie in it." Tears mixed with the rain on her face, and she reached for his arm, her fingers trembling. "I love you, Mark." For a moment, he almost softened. Almost. But then he remembered the texts, the photos, the humiliation. He pulled his arm away, his resolve hardening. "You love yourself, Denise," he said. "And now, you can have yourself. All to yourself." Without another word, he climbed into his car and drove off, leaving her standing there in the rain. The final blow came the following week when Denise was served a court order barring her from accessing any of Mark's assets. She had been forced to move into a shabby apartment on the outskirts of town, and the lifestyle she'd once flaunted was now a distant memory. Mark, on the other hand, thrived. His business flourished, his confidence soared, and he found solace in reconnecting with old friends and hobbies. He even started dating again, cautiously, but with the knowledge that he deserved better than the lies and betrayal he had endured. The last time he saw Denise was at a mutual friends gathering, where she barely met his eyes before slipping out the door. Mark didn't follow. He didn't need to. Denise's downfall rippled further than even Mark had anticipated. The whispers and pointed stares followed her everywhere, at the grocery store, at her hastily acquired office temp job. Even at the gym, she frequented to cling to a semblance of her old life. The once pristine image she had curated was in tatters, and there was no hiding from the shame. Mark, meanwhile, had been meticulous in his execution. He never gloated publicly, never so much as hinted at the details of their split to mutual acquaintances. Instead, he let Denise's actions speak for themselves. But one day, the opportunity for poetic justice presented itself in a way Mark couldn't resist. It happened at a local charity gala, an event the two of them had attended together every year as a power couple. Mark debated skipping it altogether, but the thought of Denise skulking around the edges of the social scene while he reclaimed his place intrigued him. He arrived sharp and confident, his tailored suit immaculate. Heads turned as he walked into the grand ballroom, and several familiar faces greeted him warmly. "Mark," came a voice he recognized instantly. Trisha, one of Denise's closest former friends, approached him with a sly grin, looking dashing as ever. "And might I say, it's a relief to see you here solo this year." Mark chuckled, raising an eyebrow. "You don't miss the drama?" Trisha leaned in conspiratorially. "Oh, there's plenty of drama, just not the kind that embarrasses the rest of us by association." Denise made quite the impression at last year's gala, if you can call drunkenly throwing a glass of wine at a waiter an impression. Mark smirked but said nothing, allowing Trisha's words to hang in the air. He scanned the room, his sharp gaze locking onto Denise at the far end of the ballroom. She was dressed to impress, but her appearance was overshadowed by the hesitant, almost desperate way she moved through the crowd. People barely acknowledged her, their polite smiles masking disinterest or outright disdain. And then Mark spotted his opportunity. At the center of the room stood the event organizer, a respected philanthropist named Miranda Kane. Denise had been angling for an introduction to Miranda for years, dreaming of gaining access to her elite network. And now Mark was about to make sure that door was slammed shut. He approached Miranda with a confident stride, exchanging pleasantries before steering the conversation toward the topic of infidelity, carefully and without naming names. Miranda listened, her expression a mixture of curiosity and distaste as Mark wove a tale of betrayal, trust shattered, and consequences delivered. By the time Denise finally worked up the nerve to approach Miranda, the damage was already done. Miranda's polite but frosty demeanor left no doubt that she wanted nothing to do with her. Mark, standing nearby with a glass of champagne, met Denise's panicked gaze with a subtle smirk. The rest of the evening played out exactly as Mark had envisioned. Denise left early, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Mark stayed, mingling with ease and even securing a promising business partnership by the end of the night. As he drove home, he felt a rare sense of closure. Denise's world had crumbled, and though he hadn't lifted a finger in public retaliation, he'd ensured her true colors were known where it mattered most. The gala was just the beginning. Mark's calculated moves continued to ripple through Denise's crumbling world, each one a quiet reminder of the man she had underestimated. Yet for Mark, there was one final piece of revenge he had been saving, a conclusion as personal as it was devastating. Denise had always clung to her social image like armor. Even now, in her reduced circumstances, she attempted to maintain an air of sophistication and superiority. But Mark knew her secrets. He knew where her skeletons were buried, and it was time to unearth them. 2 weeks later, Denise was sitting in her small, sparsely decorated apartment when the knock came. She opened the door to find a courier holding an envelope with her name scrawled in Mark's unmistakable handwriting. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary. "Delivery, ma'am," the courier replied, tipping his cap before walking away. Denise closed the door and ripped open the envelope, her hands shaking. Inside was a single USB drive and a note. "Play it. Enjoy. Mark." Her stomach churned as she inserted the drive in her laptop. The video file began playing, and her heart sank. It was footage from one of her trysts with Gabe, captured by a hidden camera in the motel room. The angle was damning, the audio crystal clear. She watched in horror as her laughter filled the room, her voice dripping with condescension as she joked about Mark's obliviousness. The file ended abruptly, leaving Denise trembling in the harsh glow of the laptop screen. She thought back to the gala, to the cold stares and whispered judgments. Had Mark already shared this? Was this his warning, or was it just the beginning? Her phone buzzed. It was Mark. "You got my gift," he said coolly when she answered. "Mark, please," she stammered, tears threatening to spill. "You can't show this to anyone. I'll lose everything." Mark's laugh was low and sharp. You already lost everything, Denise. This? This is just a keepsake. A little reminder of what happens when you betray me. I'll do anything, she pleaded. Just don't. You already did everything, he interrupted. I don't need to do anything else. You're going to destroy yourself, trying to keep people from finding out. And honestly, I'm content to watch. The line went dead, leaving Denise clutching the phone, her world spinning. Mark, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. The video wasn't meant for the world. It was meant for her. A final, private dagger to remind her that he held the power now. For the first time in months, Mark felt a profound sense of peace. He had been wronged, humiliated, betrayed, but he had emerged stronger. And while Denise scrambled to salvage what remained of her reputation, Mark was already looking toward the future. A future without lies, without betrayal, without her. Denise's descent into isolation was swift and unforgiving. The fear of the video's exposure consumed her every waking moment. Every phone call, every email, every interaction was shadowed by paranoia. She withdrew further into her hollow existence, cutting ties with the few friends who hadn't already distanced themselves. Mark, however, had no intention of releasing the footage. He didn't need to. The mere existence of it, the knowledge that he held such devastating leverage, was punishment enough. Denise would spend her days living in quiet dread, and that was the closure he needed. Months later, Mark sat on the patio of his new home, overlooking a serene lake. He sipped his coffee, the morning sun warming his face, and marveled at how much had changed. His life, once suffocating under the weight of Denise's lies, now felt lighter, freer. The divorce had been finalized weeks earlier, with Mark walking away with full ownership of the house and most of their assets. Denise, unrepresented and defeated, had barely contested the settlement. Her pride, once unshakable, was now a memory as distant as her former life. Mark thought back to the man he'd been before the betrayal, the trusting husband, the devoted partner. He wasn't that man anymore. He was sharper now, wiser, and he vowed never to let anyone manipulate him again. As he watched the gentle ripples on the lake, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Sarah, a colleague he'd reconnected with at the gala. She'd become a frequent part of his new life, bright, honest, and untainted by the shadows of his past. Coffee later? Or something stronger? The text read, accompanied by a winking emoji. Mark smiled. Something stronger. Your call. He set the phone down, leaning back in his chair with a contented sigh. The scars Denise had left would never fully fade, but they no longer defined him. She was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a chapter he'd closed for good. The revenge had been sweet, but the freedom? That was even sweeter.